With each passing day, we supposedly get one day closer to the release of Silksong. It's weird to even think that the perpetual wait for the elusive sequel might one day be over, but it's true. With the community discussing release windows practically every day now, one can catch themselves feeling like the game is right around the corner. Of course, it's debatable if that is actually the case, but I don't think there's anything wrong with getting a little excited, right? The excitement in itself, however, comes with a slight edge of nostalgia, a tendency to reminisce on what made the original game so special in the first place. We all hope that Silksong will be able to recapture that special something we so desperately seek in video games. What Team Cherry is seemingly taking their time to ensure is that the finished product is as close to bringing back that cathartic feeling as it possibly can be. Now that's all well and good, but it only brings us back to the original question. What was it that made the first game so exceptional? Without much fanfare, I'd argue that at the core of its success lie three aspects: the awe-inspiring world, the precise combat, and the complementary narrative. I also believe that the order in which I listed these is of the essence, and you'll see why in a bit. Now, if you made it past the introduction part of the video, I assume you already have some semblance of familiarity with Hollow Knight. Unfortunately, though, that may not be enough. From this point on, the video will touch upon various specific elements of the game, which most likely require at least one complete playthrough to fully grasp. This is most important when it comes to discussing the subject at hand, the design of the game. When talking about video games, design suddenly becomes a much broader term. It splits into a number of different subcategories, such as level design, world design, character design, art design, system design, and so on, but for the purpose of this section, we will only need the first two. Of course, this is not to say that the game fails in all other aspects, quite the contrary. Hollow Knight generally stands its ground when inspected in most of its departments, and believe me, we will be returning to that. For now though, let's focus merely on those two previously mentioned properties. As you know, much like the term design, Hollowness is also split into many smaller chunks, the various areas the player will be exploring on their adventure. Looking at the undivided map, I would hazard a guess that even those who haven't played the game might be able to provide general outlines of the aforementioned regions. Assuming this, we can say that the world is diverse, which is already handy when the game so heavily depends on how the player perceives its slowly unfolding map. Now, let's look at those zones as how we see them in-game. Caverns, holes, sewers, that's true, but if we peel back the curtain, what is left is a bunch of floating colliders, triggers, interactable objects, and so forth. However, neither of those two states of presentation interest us. What we want to diverge our attention to is the fabric of the curtain, so to speak. We're talking how well the game carries the blend between its environment and its level layout, which for me is the single most impressive feat this game achieves. The previously mentioned diversity of the game was purely visual, but what truly distinguishes City of Tears from Deepnest in our memory is that the former is mainly traversed through its relatively spacious and well-lit buildings, while the latter is a collection of the world's most dim and narrow corridors. And this just keeps going. The open-air platforming spaces of Howling Cliffs, paths blocked off by giant vines in Green Path, tunnels in the graves of Resting Grounds. You get the point. I understand that all of this is not some kind of grand revelation, but I also think that is exactly why the world is so immersive. Hollow Knight is a game that I don't believe has tried to reinvent the wheel, but instead chose to hone in on the aspects of the genre that Team Cherry decided truly mattered. The resulting focus on the previously mentioned design convergence led us to the consistent, interconnected, and non-linear hollowness that we venture through now, and it cannot be understated how much those three aspects contribute to the reception of this game. I've already talked about the first one because its importance bleeds into the other two, and especially to its interconnectedness. Because one of the design aims was to make the world consistent, it also means that different zones had to match each other, physically. The breadth of the space had to be maintained through loading screens, sure, but that couldn't undermine the inexplicable mushroom land being next to a whole city. This is why in the former, there are places in which this characteristic urban style of architecture shines through, and in the latter, this very same architecture is sometimes overgrown with giant fungi. However, what challenges this outlook on the interconnectedness is that at times, more jarring transitions do occur. By those I mostly mean whenever we traverse the Dream Realm, or take a tram of all things, Fortunately, both of those transitions are justified in their own way. The Dream Realm serves as this kind of spiritual reflection of Hallownest, and so it closely resembles its lucid counterpart. The tram, though, is a whole different beast, and to tackle it, we will have to fast forward a few years to Elden Ring, a game that also primarily thrives off of its world design. In Elden Ring, when clearing the open world, you might encounter chests that, when opened, teleport you to a whole different section of the map, which, at that point, you most likely haven't yet seen. This serves as a sort of enticement for the player. They get to see the broader scale of the map, as well as a snippet of what it has to offer. Now, the problem that emerges is that some, but not all of the places you teleport to, are completely separate from the rest of the map, and are nothing else but viewpoints essentially. Randomly stumbling upon a massive dragon corpse is a spectacle, sure, but it becomes less so when not given any context. Juxtapose this with Hollow Knight, where taking the tram does almost the exact same thing, but every single travel point is fully integrated into the rest of the map. It really makes you appreciate how well the world loops in on itself. Which, conveniently, brings us to the non-linearity of the map, and I don't think it warrants much explanation. If you've played the game, you know exactly how it operates. Most of the in-game areas have a couple of different ways of entering or exiting. You can reach the resting grounds by taking a tram from the Forgotten Crossroads or by falling through a hole in Crystal Peak. You can leave back by the same tram, by taking an elevator to the city, or by swimming through the Blue Lake. You get the gist of it. The goal of this approach is to create a certain flow with the gameplay loop, one in which the player never really feels like they are heading in the wrong direction. The side effect of this is when a player does in fact not know where to go, searching for a new path in such a wide space can possibly get discouraging. Hollow Knight has a sort of interesting solution for this. See, the problem is not that a new path is too obscurely hidden, it's just that, in typical Metroidvania fashion, some branches of the map are locked behind mobility upgrades, and you need to remember which part of the map requires which upgrade to access. The outrageous sounding solution to this is, well, just memorize the whole map, which in and of itself sounds crazy, but is also where Cornifer steps in. The first couple of trips through an area can, and most likely will, leave the player off without the map unlocked, so unless they want to stumble around for a good while, they are subconsciously forced to memorize some sections of the world. Because of this, when they eventually find the map, it is much easier for them to connect the actual game world to its scribbled counterpart. Of course, this doesn't completely resolve the whole overarching problem, but it goes a long way in helping to make the exploration feel a bit less overwhelming. This is then reinforced by the already discussed consistency and interconnectivity, so that's how we'll return to the original point. Looking back at Hollow Knight, there never really was the impression that the game slowed down too much. Obviously, the game is supposed to be approached more slowly and methodically, but what I mean is that its pacing still remains fairly consistent throughout the whole experience. This stems from many things, of course, but I would wager that most of it comes from how the game's levels and world are designed. Hallownest being perfectly formed to fit the Metroidvania mode is precisely what makes it feel exciting to explore. The smooth transitions between regions, the various shortcuts, and the overall structure all paint a convincing enough picture of this destroyed, barely held together world, yet the world in question is still a ton of fun to explore. It's also worth mentioning that its scale is simply astounding. There were 3 separate occasions in which I was left in total disbelief over how the game was still withholding more to discover. Now, with all those praises sung, you should understand why I think awe is the most succinct description of the feeling that exploration in Hollow Knight evokes. Slowly descending to the main streets of the City of Tears, opening the Abyss Door, witnessing the mysteriously vanished White Palace are all moments that fall into the category of I wish I could forget it so I could live through it for the first time again. Experiences of this caliber are ones that I hold in the highest possible regard, and for Hollow Knight, it's all accentuated by the proficiency its developers showed in designing its world. Moving away from the general level and world design, which I consider to be the slow burn parts of the experience, let's dive into the moment-to-moment gameplay of Hollow Knight, its main attraction and attention grabber. The first thing we need to establish is that the game approaches most of its interactable elements with consistency as their forefront aspect. This is already exposed at the very beginning of the game, when we first get acquainted with the player character. The knight's movement has no acceleration, their horizontal velocity is completely static, and they stop the very moment the player instructs them to stop. The same rule of this constant velocity applies to other values as well, such as the maximum jump and fall speed, the dash length, or the puck or bounce distance. This, in many cases, also extends to the enemy AI styles of movement. We have simple ones, such as wall-crawling bugs that stroll along a specific direction at a constant speed, but we also have more complex examples, such as flying enemies, that always follow a regular, rigid path to attack the player the same way every time. At face value, all of this makes the game sound incredibly boring to play, but the intent of this is only revealed when we yet again return to the gameplay loop. As evident by the above, besides the exploration and occasional platforming, Hollow Knight is primarily comprised of its widespread and varied combat encounters. In terms of progression, they represent the majority of the game's skill checks, which naturally puts their quality under the heaviest scrutiny. This brings us to a wider selection of topics, so let's start with how the game handles the relationship between its combat difficulty and the numerous player upgrades. Hollow Knight presents the player with three types of upgrades: the permanent moveset expansions, permanent stat improvements, and a customizable set of boosts in the form of charms. While we will be taking a look at the kit later, for now it is really impressive how on a blind playthrough, sometimes acquiring a single one of its components is enough to make the player feel like they have just become overpowered. In reality, the tight level design binds them to ensure that the game doesn't easily unravel or break apart. Of course, it is very much possible to trivialize parts of the experience, but it is also quite unlikely that one could be able to, for instance, find all of the paylords before fighting the Mantis Lords. However, perhaps the most admirable facet of Hollow Knight's progression is that regular enemies don't have any stat scalings. Their meticulous distribution and placement in the world make up for that, and ensure the fluidity of the difficulty level. It must have taken a tremendous amount of effort to tweak numbers or close off certain paths just to upkeep the overall balance. This approach also doesn't take away from the satisfaction of getting a power-up, since with the exception of Forgotten Crossroads, returning to already visited areas still makes the player fight the same enemies they have fought there previously. Things start to get a little bit more complex though when we delve into the boss fights of the game. In Hollow Knight, there is a staggering number of 47 bosses total, which may go down depending on whether we count the remixes of previous fights or not. For the sake of this section, however, they will have to be accounted for, since all of them feature distinct movesets. Now, I'd argue that when it comes to enriching the gameplay, a substantial amount of those 47 bosses are of middling to good quality, while only a handful can be considered truly great or, well, awful. I also acknowledge that this was the most standard, nothing-burger sentence I could have said about the game's bosses, as it could essentially be applied for most video games out there, but bear with me here. My argument is that no matter the quality of the fight, they all stay true to the game's underlying tenets. To illustrate that even in the most dire of cases the previous sentence still holds mostly true, let's dive into the deeper subjective and consider my pick for the worst fight in the game. Ascended Markoth is a fight the player unlocks fairly late into the game and is most likely meant to be approached with all the available upgrades. Its main divergence from the ordinary counterpart is that the floor has been turned into a damage zone. This change doesn't necessarily create any problems of its own, but it only underlines the ones that have already pre-existed with the original fight, such as daggers spawning outside of player view, and the overall awkwardness of trying to predict the shield's circular movement. Couple that with the available iframe options that could easily send the player falling into the abyss, and you have a fantastic setup for a terrible experience. With that said, these issues come up not because of the fight sticking out in any sort of particular way, but because of an overlook in behavior programming and an incompatibility of certain elements at play. If we take a look at the consistency aspect, we come to find out that, technically speaking, the fight doesn't really work any different than anything the player had seen in the game by that point. Markoth positions himself much in the same way any other ghastly enemy previously did in the game. The daggers start moving after an exact amount of time and also move at the same speed in each phase. It's all by the book Hollow Knight design. I'll repeat myself here, but Ascended Markoth is what I consider to be the worst of this game's bosses, and not even marginally. Every other one of them is an improvement over what I just mentioned, and I believe that if I haven't convinced you to my outlook on the bosses by now, we might as well move on. Last thing I intend to touch upon is the player kit. Starting off, let me not repeat myself about the consistency of it, because it's all the same as with everything we've discussed thus far. What I intend to direct your attention towards is how overall well-rounded the kit is. With the Knight fully upgraded, the player has the ability to walk, jump, double jump, wall jump, short dash, infinite dash, attack horizontally and vertically with the use of spells and melee attacks, as well as bounce on enemies with the downward melee strike. Putting the last ability aside, we have a very simple and standard, yet deep and satisfying moveset that encourages practice by the virtue of the world surrounding the player. In your own playthrough, you might have noticed that Hollow Knight has one very characteristic feature, which is that it doesn't have any slopes you can walk on. Part of me thinks that sloped surfaces are generally hard to get working right, and Team Cherry might have just tried to simplify things for themselves because of their limited budget and development time. According to this comment by Mosbag, that was most likely the case, but a more compelling explanation is that it's one of the many examples of the game being mindful of the player kit. The very strict, straight lines in which the Knight is propelled by their abilities make the blocky environment feel natural and seamless, especially during the combat encounters. This brings us back to the previously excused ability, pogoing off of enemies, and if I were to pick one, this is definitely my favorite out of the entire kit. I'll preface this by saying I haven't played Zelda 2 or Shovel Knight, so Hollow Knight was my first and, well, only exposure to the pogo ability, and when I first used it, I immediately knew I wanted to finish this game. I could go on about how it takes the simple movement and evolves it from repetitive to engaging, how it is a marvel that there is no formal introduction to the mechanic, but it is implicitly revealed to the player at many different points throughout the game, how it is so core to the experience, yet at no point you are required to use it to beat the game, but no. All I want to say is that using this ability is satisfying on each and every instance of its execution, and that is probably sufficient for you to see how great of a mechanic this is in my eyes. So we have talked all about the combat, its consistency, its harmony with the rest of the world, and its satisfying elements, but it is only when talking about the moveset did I mention its most appealing property, the deep simplicity. I think an effective way of illustrating what I mean is playing a small portion of an old trailer of the game. So what we're looking at is essentially a Flash game. But what is the true difference between now and then? Well, the camera movement has been smoothened and adjusted, we have better shaders and overall light work. We also gained some more frames by the engine change, however the movement and combat system seem to look identical to the final product. This is because the ingenuity of Hollow Knight's combat lies specifically in how simple but hard to master it is. It is neither overdone nor a numbing bore, but rather quick, to the point, and most importantly, precise, giving the player a great deal of agency over every fight's outcome. So by this definition, the simplicity of the gameplay complements Hollow Knight much in the same way that the simplicity of a story can considerably benefit its impact. Speaking of which, both of Hollow Knight's story and lore are so unbelievably vague and detailed that I don't know during which of their numerous crunch hours Team Cherry have managed to write it. It may be contrary to what I will be saying in a bit, but I typically take issue with these types of stories. They are highly prone to error, and it's usually either that the nonlinearity doesn't prove rewarding enough, or the story is obscure to the point of being unintelligible. With Hollow Knight, though, things are a bit different, and, unsurprisingly, it yet again returns us to the consistency. The plot of this game falls into the category of what I would call the modern Metroidvania industry standard. It goes basically like this. We have the chosen hero, who for one reason or another, is called upon to return or venture into a land, be it haunted or infected, to uncover its mystery and save it from certain doom by heroically sacrificing themselves in the process. It's a story that clearly works, seeing as it is told over and over again, but I'd wager that out of all of its iterations I've seen in video games, Hollow Knight is as close to being perfectly utilized as it could be. So then, let's look at the narrative qualities that I appreciated the most during my initial playthrough. First of all, embeddedness. I've seen far too many bosses, areas, or NPCs in other games that were obviously designed first and then retroactively written into the story. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't what Team Cherry did, as it is usually the standard procedure in game development. The difference is that practically none of their base game bosses are disjointed from the world, and they all enrich the narrative by having an explainable part in the events of the game. Then there is the discovery side of the story. This is the area in which I've witnessed the least amount of failures by other devs, but nonetheless, it's very important for a game that presents its story in a non-linear fashion to have moments of discovery be impactful and helpful in putting together the bigger picture. There are a couple of meh finds scattered here and there, but overall, Hollow Knight passes the test. After that, we have the coherency of it all. Even though the game's story tackles some rather conceptual topics that, for budgetary reasons, all concern bugs, the player can still make sense of it all. There aren't many jarring plot holes, since the game provides multiple pieces of information that explain its more outlandish elements. And this isn't to say that the game's plot is easy to decipher. I'd bet that around 70 to 80% of people who have finished the game either didn't care enough to dissect the story, or tried but eventually gave up. This is fine, as rather than the actual contents of the narrative, its delivery is probably the more important quality of the game. Seeing as Hollow Knight is an experience centered around exploration and combat, we can see a certain correlation between the delivery of the story and the game's main pillars. What I mean by this is that the narrative doesn't really interrupt the gameplay and, instead, delegates some of the lore workload onto the environmental storytelling, which is then delivered to the player on the account of exploration. The non-intrusiveness is fairly easy to explain, so I'll do it by saying that if the player follows one of the 5-hour speedrun routes for the game, they would be subject to only around 7 or 8 mandatory story interruptions. Now, it is obvious that a speedrun route does not represent how a regular playthrough of a game might go, but it shows the level of agency the game offers to the player over how much they have to interact with the story. As for the role of the environmental storytelling, I suppose it's something you've gathered from experience. It's not exactly explainable with 1 or 2 examples, because it's consistently present across the whole game. We have the 4th suspiciously broken chair in the Mantis Lord's arena, and then later on we fight the Traitor Lord. We have corpses falling from the sky in Kingdom's Edge, and then we find the Colosseum. We have the constant rain in an underground city, and a dripping lake just above it. There is a lot of this in Hollow Knight, and a lot to appreciate about it, mainly because it drastically decreases the amount of exposition the game would have to carry out if all of this information was instead communicated by any other means. Going back to the delivery, you may have noticed I have talked all around concrete matters such as actual dialogue quality or the execution of the MMIS, and that is simply because I am extremely biased on the topic. There is something about excessively somber and broken worlds with brooding characters that just speaks to my soul. By the end of the game, I was somewhat moved by what I had just witnessed, even though the final act of the story involves an experiment child stabbing himself over his own failures, so you see why I might not be a reliable source for an honest review. I suppose it's the combination of the solemn soundtrack, the gloomy setting, and the clear-cut art style that masquerades the somewhat over-the-top plot of the game into an actual highly enjoyable piece of media for me. So with that said, I hope you can now see why I consider the narrative of Hollow Knight to be primarily an extension of all of the other components of the game. It mostly helps them shine, and where the combat was, at face value, the simple and easy to digest part of the experience, the story serves as the more complex and daunting aspect. What I like about this symbiosis is that, in a way, it exposes us to the game's biggest strength, which is its consistent direction. Talking about a strong direction is a bit odd in the case of an indie game, since third-party influence doesn't really interfere with the creative process of the small team at play. What's interesting about Hollow Knight is that despite this observation, the level of care in which all of the game's design pieces fall into place is one that the grand majority of fully realized games do not even come close to reaching. It's truly impressive how the vision of the team is so deeply ingrained in all areas of the game that its authenticity managed to captivate so many people. In all honesty, I think that the previous statement coincides quite well with the 3 sections of the video and constitutes a good enough summary of my thoughts on what made the game the cult classic it has become. It's incredible that Hollow Knight is only the first real game made by Team Cherry, and so I think that, as a bonus, a quick and selective glance at which qualities of the original should make a return for the sequel is nothing but in order. To kick things off, I need to acknowledge that, believe it or not, we do have palpable evidence of Silksong's existence. What this means is that we aren't completely in the dark when it comes to speculating about the various features of the sequel, and that we can examine the things we are already aware of. I suppose it's a good outline for how to talk about what seems to be this colossus of a video game, without wandering too much into the biases-muddled fantasy. And it is right after that sentence, I shall move on to talk about a very specific game design pet peeve of mine, which would be consumables. The grievance mostly stems from a certain mindset that they seem to force the player to adapt, which can be summed up with, "I won't use them, I will need them later." This ever-present notion is so universal that even with the system seeing better and worse implementations in a multitude of different games, the players only seem to move across the scale of the hunch's intensity, never really outside of it. Silksong seems to be no exception to this, as it introduces us to the impishly tongue-twistery named shell shards that, for those acquainted, appear to work in a similar way to the spirit emblems from Sekiro. The characteristic trait of both of these systems is that parts of the player arsenal are limited to a set amount of uses per rest, but also by an outside resource that you gather by simply playing the game. In theory, this makes the resource easy to collect and helps alleviate the "I will need them later" part of the problem, but for me it only poses an obligatory question. Why even have the resource to begin with? Look at it my way. If the player is able to use special tools infinitely, as long as they have the resource, then the intent of this system is to reward players who went out of their way to prepare for the given occasion, and also make each consumable a scarce and valuable find. On the other hand, if the player is only constrained by a number of uses per rest, then the intent is to have powerful tools be utilized frequently but not carelessly. Having these two systems put together in the long term only opens up the possibility of the player having to grind for the resource that, I remind you, is essential for using some of the game's rudimentary mechanics. This only returns us to the original problem, because it discourages the player from engaging with the full extent of what the game has to offer. With that said, I do not have the full vision of the game's developers, so this system might have a broader context that for now remains completely hidden. This means I wouldn't necessarily call the shell shards an issue with the game's design, but more so a slight worry concerning it. Now, from what we've seen, the rest of the game looks simply spectacular. The precise movement seems to be making a return, with a bit more variation this time around, which in turn should make the platforming sections more robust and challenging. The evolved art style looks gorgeous, although the world seems to be a lot less dark and more lively in nature. Whether the somberness of Hallownest will be something we'll sorely miss in the sequel remains to be seen. However, judging by the glimpses of the gameplay we got, I think the atmosphere of Fireloom makes for a good parallel to Hornet's overall personality. While we are at it, it's also fairly interesting that Hornet will not be a silent protagonist, which you might not know, as the distinction of her lines from those of any other characters is laughably awful. Anyway, this change opens up a lot of narrative opportunities. Introspective monologues, clear exposition, actual interactions, all of that great stuff. But there are also pitfalls to be wary of, such as introspective monologues, clear exposition, actual interactions. You know what I'm getting at. Unfortunately, with what we have now, we can't really tell what this double-edged sword means for the storytelling quality, so let's move past that for now. We also have some samples from the OST of Silksong. While I'm definitely no music critic, I think that the two tracks managed to channel the first game's energy in a subtle enough manner, while also delivering something fittingly fresh for the new kingdom. As for anything I would like to touch upon from the pure speculation label, well, there's a number of people expressing the opinion that a return to Hallownest in Silksong is something quite likely to happen. I would be all in for this, but an important factor to consider is the execution. An excessively long venture to the last map could reduce the initial impact of seeing it again, but only delegating it to a cutscene would leave it mostly disappointing. It's a hard balance to strike, and if it comes down to it, I sincerely hope the final effect will make for a far better revision of the idea than any of mine. There's also the ongoing discussion on whether the game is a prequel or a sequel. Personally, I would prefer the game to be a sequel, and I also believe it to be one, But it's here where the analysis starts reaching into the hypotheticals, so let's go on ahead and summarize. There isn't a shadow of a doubt in my mind that Silksong will be picked apart and heavily scrutinized in each of its aspects within days or maybe even hours of its release. This puts an insurmountable amount of pressure on Team Cherry to deliver a piece worthy of the never-ending wait. After such a long time, can even the most level-headed individuals manage their excitement and judge the game through the lenses of tempered expectations? This is something we'll have to find out soon, I hope, but if all we have to go by is the original game, then I am not particularly worried. In spite of all the problems that the team had to overcome during the development, we are still left with one of the most inspiring indie games of all time. A game with a direction so pristinely focused, a world so sprawling and grand, a narrative so complex and detailed, and all of it mended together by a combat system so fluid and expressive that I don't think the competence of the developers is something that can even be questioned at all. I don't believe there's a world in which the final product is a bad or even an average game, and most likely neither do you. However, it's the very existence of the sequel that poses a worrying question. What would an evolution of Hollow Knight even look like? That's not to say that the original is perfect, but if anything, it is contained. The likely but close-minded solution, then, is that Silksong will need to be something completely fresh, not a retread of past ideas. The teasers we got thus far encourage us to view the game that way, but in the end, they are just that. Teasers. Their trustworthy source is a nice bonus, but with that tangent we keep avoiding the only real and rational answer to the evolution question. It's simply that, as it is with all things, in time we shall have to see. Thank you for watching.